We extend our gratitude to our featured guest tonight, Representative Jon Hansen. Elizabeth Burns-Thompson. And our moderator, Sara Frankenstein. The Sioux River Republican Women would like to thank our co-hosts tonight, the Dakota Scout and the South Dakota Federation of Republican Women, along with our sponsors, who without their monetary and in-kind donations, this event would not be happening. We are grateful for your support. Tonight's debate will be a spirited discussion of ideas where differing perspectives and visions for our future will take center stage. I invite you to listen intently, for it is through the exchange of well-reasoned arguments and thoughtful discourse that you can truly say you are informed, not influenced. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Sara Frankenstein. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carrie. Welcome. I want to go over the rules of today's debate, starting with the rules for the audience. So you may clap after an answer that you like, but please, no disruptive interjections from the audience. No shouting, no talking. Please be respectful to our speakers. We're very happy to have them with us today, and we're going to show them respect. We do have security on site. You can and may be asked to leave if you're disruptive or disrespectful to our speakers. Earlier today, we had a coin toss to determine who gives their introduction and closing statements first tonight. Elizabeth Burns-Thompson won the coin toss, and she will begin with a 2-minute introduction, followed by Representative Jon Hansen. Questions will be posed in an alternating fashion, allowing the recipient 3 minutes to respond. Then the other speaker will be given 3 minutes to respond to the same question and rebut the previous speaker's comments. At the end of tonight's debate, both speakers will be given 5 minutes for their closing comments. Thank you to Carrie Wagner, who will be running the timer. And speakers, you'll see that the timer is going to click away, so I do expect you to stick to the time. If you don't, I will interrupt you to keep our debate moving smoothly and fairly. As you have likely heard, 2 companies, Summit Carbon Solutions and Navigator CO2, are planning on building carbon dioxide pipelines in the eastern part of our state. Speakers on both sides of the issues were gracious enough to participate in tonight's debate. South Dakotans continue to debate the issue, with Republicans on both sides. Our hosts have sponsored tonight's event in order to delve into the pros and cons of those proposed projects. The hosts of tonight's event, like Carrie said, seek to inform but not influence, and provide the public with as much information as possible in a fair and orderly manner. With that, let's begin. Ms. Burns-Thompson, you may begin your introduction.
Just make sure, yes, this one is on. We were given specific instructions not to completely repeat our bio that is in your handout, so I won't do that. What I do want to make sure I start with this evening is, sorry, I'm not on. Okay. Thank you for pointing that out for me. We'll get a little bit better as we get throughout the night. But a couple highlights I do want to make note of is that for many of you, we might have come in with a difference of opinions about the project, but at the end of the day, we share more in common than we are different. Like many of you, I come from a farm. My family still farms. I've had the great benefit and opportunity to spend the entirety of my career working in and for and on behalf of farmers every step of the way, and I see this project much the same. Breaking down to my values and my background, again, very shared with many of you in this audience. I do think that, like I said, we will walk away at the end of this evening with the ability to agree to disagree on certain things, but I do hope that tonight is the opportunity to start a dialogue and certainly not the end of it. So I extend this as an invitation to continue to please engage with myself, our company, others in the space to continue to ask questions and have the dialogue like we're going to go through this evening. So with that, I'll toss it back.
A 2-minute introduction from Representative Hansen.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. It's great to see so many friendly faces in the crowd. I just want to, first of all, say thank you to the organizers, Carrie, Catherine, and thank you to Sara for moderating this as well. All the organizations, all the co-hosts. I know it was a lot of work putting all this together, so really appreciate it. I think it's a really, really important discussion to be had today. And I do want to start out too, just with a word of appreciation and respect to Ms. Burns-Thompson for being willing to come up to South Dakota and have this debate publicly. So kudos to you. I think that's great. Like many of the affected landowners, I'm a 5th-generation South Dakotan. My family took a claim under the Homestead Act while we were still the Dakota Territory. The first house that they ever had was a dugout in the side of a hill in Clay County. Pretty amazing if you think about it. And it just kind of helps you to appreciate the value of land, property, and what it means for families all across the state of South Dakota. So I'm a representative in District 25. I live in Dell Rapids, South Dakota with my wife Sheila. We've got 6 kids, 11 and under. So it's, you think it's crazy in here or just wait. It's a wild house at my place, and we love it that way. Actually, 5 are born, and 1 is not born. 1 is due like basically any minute. So if I have to like run off the stage and go home, that's why. I'm sorry. In fact, just like the other day, it was, well, not this last night, but the night before. I thought we were having that baby. We were up until 5:36 a.m. with my wife having all these contractions and everything, but no baby. So here we are. I'm grateful to be here. I'm here today because, I'm a representative in this state. I swore an oath to the Constitution to defend our people, and I think it's really important that we defend our South Dakotans' God-given constitutional private property rights.
The first question goes to Representative Hansen. He gets 3 minutes to respond, and then Ms. Burns-Thompson will have 3 minutes to rebut or respond to the question. How important is government subsidy to making the CO2 capture, pipeline burial, and transport project financially possible? And what happens if a different administration or a new Congress ends such subsidies in the future?
Well, the answer is it's everything to this project, frankly. I would characterize this project as a boondoggle. This wouldn't be happening without the 45Q tax credit that's funding the sequestration of this carbon. And that's just the reality of it, folks. I mean, you might hear something different, but the reality is there's no free market that's driving this. This is being driven by massive federal subsidy. And so really the answer is that simple. If there's a different administration, that might change. I'd be grateful for a different administration, frankly, that would put an end to the 45Q tax credit and we could restore the free market. Because at the end of the day, if we have a free market deciding whether this carbon gets sequestered or not, I guarantee you it's not going to happen. There's just not a market for it. So that's just the reality.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, your response.
I think we're going to have our first opportunity to agree but disagree here. And looking specifically at the 45Q, well, let's take a step back. I was here in South Dakota beginning to do outreach on this project in the fall of 2021. Most of you have become familiar with things like the 45Q because of the most recent activity that expanded the value of those credits, which took place in 2022. What most are not aware of is the fact that the 45Q has actually been around since 2008. Up until very recently, it actually was pretty politically one-sided. It was a product of the Bush administration in 2008. Those credit values were further expanded under the Trump administration in 2018. And then most recently, in 2022, those values were then expanded again. This type of incentive absolutely has been in place for multiple decades at this point and has driven investment and activity to date. Has it spurred additional growth most recently? Absolutely. Another point that I'd like to highlight too is I think the concept that you said about free markets or the other market drivers in this space. Those of you, and I've seen some familiar faces in the audience, have sat through presentations on behalf of our project today, or thus far. You remember that when I talk about the drivers in this space, federal tax policy is absolutely one of those pieces. There are other legs on that value proposition stool, one of those being carbon-based programs at the state level. So when you take a step back and look at the market dynamics of what are the biggest sectors or the biggest marketplaces for fuel domestically, that is the West Coast, predominantly California and the rest of the coast. Internationally, our biggest marketplace for fuel is our neighbors to the north in Canada. What do those two marketplaces share? A carbon-based program that values every unit of fuel that goes into that marketplace. You'll note I said unit, not just gallons, because every gallon of ethanol, every gallon of diesel, every unit of propane, every unit of natural gas is evaluated under a carbon metric. And so these types of investments are being made in response to not only federal tax policy, that's obviously a driver, but also the marketplaces out there. Our customers, our largest customers, are saying that carbon is a characteristic that determines the value of those fuel sources, and these companies are making investments to ensure that they're competitive under that.
Thank you. Our next question is to Ms. Burns-Thompson. You just explained who Navigator's consumer is. Can you explain how that relates to South Dakota's corn industry, its ethanol producers?
Sure. In fact, I refreshed my my recollection on the corn demand. In fact, to look at my past, I spent 4.5 years with the corn growers in the state of Iowa. So understanding of not only the corn marketplace, but also all of the valuable sectors that that commodity goes into as a point of first purchasers is incredibly important. So when you take a step back and look at the, I think it's 16 million bushels of corn that's produced in this state, about 78% of that is first destination is an ethanol plant. And I say first destination because, again, for those of you that were around when we developed those facilities, there's a reason that we called them ethanol plants. Their reason was to take grain, further process it, a starch into an alcohol, and fulfill that demand for fuel. Everything else that came out of that plant was what we called a byproduct. Now, many of you, probably those that feed hogs or cattle, maybe other sectors, know that there are a number of valuable co-products coming out of those facilities. Those DDGs, that corn oil, a lot of that now destined into a biodiesel or renewable diesel facility, those marketplaces were developed, but so too was the infrastructure necessary to facilitate that development. Today, we are opening up the opportunity to further crack that kernel and monetize the last remaining piece of that kernel of corn, right? Because we're turning it into alcohol, we're turning it into dried distillers grains, we have the corn oil, and what's left? That CO2. This type of infrastructure is what is going to ensure that we are now, and I say we, as an ethanol industry, as rural America, as agriculture broadly, are truly able to monetize every piece of that corn kernel. But that's going to take marketplaces, and it's going to take infrastructure.
Representative Hansen, if we set aside the issue of eminent domain, which we will discuss in a minute, do you dispute those benefits of the proposed CO2 pipeline as Ms. Burns-Thompson has described? You have 3 minutes.
First of all, I will say, I've always been a huge proponent of ethanol. My family are corn and bean farmers. They sell a lot of their grain into the ethanol plant in Wentworth. And I think you look at my voting record over the 8 years I've been in the House, I don't think you'll find a single negative vote when it comes to ethanol. I've always put ethanol in my gas, obviously my gas tank. And so, I think when it comes to my personal record, always been very pro-ethanol. I think it's very important to the agriculture industry here in the state of South Dakota. But here's the thing. When it comes to the future viability of ethanol, I think what we're actually doing by following these policies that are set forth in California and Washington and Oregon and Canada, which the pipeline companies usually cite to, we're actually long-term going to completely destroy the ethanol industry. By the way, those policies that we're chasing after in those markets, those aren't free market policies either. Those are sort of climate-crazed regulators and legislators in those jurisdictions that are setting these policies. It's true. So in those states, in the very states that are almost always cited, California, Washington, and Oregon, those 3 states literally have books on the laws on the books today that would ban the sale of new internal combustion engines by the year 2035. And so if we're going to say we're going to chase those markets and appease those climate regulators, it's the last thing that ethanol would want to do, because those are the markets that want to completely decimate the internal combustion engine, which obviously ethanol powers. It's a terrible long-term strategy for ethanol. So we shouldn't be appeasing those people. We should be defeating those mentalities. And I think that's what will lead to the long-term viability of the ethanol industry.
We're going to move now to the topic of pipeline safety concerns. This question will be first posed to Representative Hansen. Like most of us in this room, you are concerned about citizen safety. We live here, our families live here. We want to keep people safe. But pipelines are a proven technology, one with a decent track record. Measured in terms of injuries per unit transported, pipelines are safer than trucks, safer than trains. Do you oppose pipelines in all circumstances, or is there something especially dangerous about the CO2 project under consideration here?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I definitely don't oppose pipelines in all circumstances, and I agree that in many situations, pipelines are the safest mode of transportation. It was interesting, though, North Dakota had Summit Carbon Solutions hearing before their version of the PUC. There was a gentleman there by the name of Curtis Junt, and he testified before the PUC, their version of the PUC. He's really an expert in pipelines and pipeline safety. He spent an entire career on mostly natural gas pipelines. Now, natural gas pipelines, by the way, when you talk about the pressure in one of those pipes, that's like maybe 500 or 700 PSI. For these carbon sequestration pipelines, we're talking about a pressure of about 2,200 PSI. It's so much more pressure than your standard, say, natural gas pipeline. And so this gentleman was testifying under oath before the committee. And by the way, he also has like safety companies for pipelines. I mean, he really knows his stuff. And they asked, what would you do? He lives 3 miles from their proposed route. It was their proposed route. They're gonna have to change their route because their permit was denied. But what would you do if we approve this pipeline and you live 3 miles from your house? What maybe would you do for like mitigation? And he said, the first thing that I would do is put my house on the market for sale. Because he knows in his expertise, even at a 3 mile distance. Now, we have setbacks in this state that are like 300 feet. He's saying at a 3 mile distance, he wouldn't live in his house. He said he likes to take his dogs out for a walk. And if he gets 1,000 feet from his house, he'd be afraid that if there was a rupture, he wouldn't be able to make it back. I think about our own family. Every summer, me and the kids, we like to pitch the tent in the backyard, and we'll have a couple nights out, lighting the fire and staying in the tent. Imagine if that was your house and your children, and there's a pipeline rupture in the middle of the night, and that plume comes over your family's house, what that could do to those kids. So, yeah, there's real safety concerns. And by the way, we don't have the plume studies. Navigator has refused to give those plume studies to our county commissioners. And I think when they went before the PUC, they had them shown behind closed doors, and everybody who went into the hearing at that time had to sign a confidentiality agreement so they wouldn't disclose it. And so those are the risks. They're not being forthcoming as a company when it comes to saying what the plume modeling would be. Probably the most serious safety concern is that plume modeling. They won't show us. They won't show the county commissioners. They won't show the public. And maybe Ms. Burns-Thompson tonight will commit to disclosing those to our counties and to the people. I think that would be good.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, I am going to ask you about plume studies later. So setting that topic aside, what is your response to the question about whether pipelines are safer than trucks, safer than trains?
Sure, and I don't think you need my opinion on it. I think the research and the facts speak for themselves, and I think that might be something we can certainly agree to, is the fact that pipelines are absolutely the safest and most reliable modes of transport, in large part because of the variables that are within our control in comparison to rail, in comparison to truck. What I do think is important that we highlight is transportation of CO2 is not new in this country, and not just transportation of CO2, but transportation of CO2 as a pressurized hazardous liquid. Pay attention as you're driving up and down the interstate. I did today. I counted 5 CO2 trucks at least between, I think, Sioux Falls and here. We are moving it predominantly right now via truck. Now, the portion of the ethanol industry or fertilizer industry, those being the two largest providers of CO2 into marketplaces right now, only a portion of them capture and transport. However, when you look at the opportunity that exists for additional processors to come online and thus bring more CO2 into the marketplace, you're looking at what are the modes of transport that are available. And to help quantify that, excuse me, we got a fly up here. Our system is being designed to be able to handle or manage up to 15 million metric ton of CO2. What does that look like if but for not a pipeline? That is relatively just shy of 500,000 trucks to be added on the roadways on an annual basis. But for trucks, that's instead 100,000 rail cars. That's taking away from opportunities of things that we need to be able to ship in those modes of transport, like our grain, like our DDGs, like other things that we can't move through a pipeline. So when we're looking at what the opportunities are put forward of the nature of the product, the amount of which needs to be handled, pipelines are tried and true, the most economic, the most efficient, and largely the safest mode of being able to do that.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, your promised question about plume studies. According to media reports, Navigator will not release environmental information on pipeline ruptures to landowners. Kello News reported that when Public Utilities Commissioner Gary Hansen asked why Navigator wanted to keep its plume model overview confidential, you said that the data's complexity was beyond the general public's ability to understand. Two-part question. First, is the media characterization of your comments accurate? And second, even if the plume data is difficult to understand, shouldn't the people of South Dakota have access to that data?
I'm really glad that you asked that question. And I would agree that that is unfortunately a mischaracterization of what was stated during the PUC hearings. I firmly believe my job on a day-to-day basis is not just dispersion of information, it's communication. Just sending out a plan, sending out data, sending out information is distribution of information. Our goal is to communicate, to help folks understand what is being distributed as part of that. I think it's also important to put into context the nature of information that is necessarily protected. I'm a good actor, you are a good actor, Representative Hansen is a good actor. I believe that we have a plentiful of good actors that sit in this room. The unfortunate part of the world that we live in today is that there is individuals with ill intent out there. And we do necessarily have to protect certain information, be it dispersion models. I believe also as part of that commentary that we were having at the PUC was a conversation about emergency response plans as well. There are certain things as part of those types of documents that this is not new for CO2 pipelines. That type of information is necessarily protected by Homeland Security concerns because we want to protect critical infrastructure in this country, be it a pipeline, be it a rail line, be it our other modes of transportation.
Representative Hansen, your response.
Well, I think you just heard it. I mean, towards the end of my last response, I did ask Ms. Burns-Thompson if she would be willing to release those plume modelings. By the way, that's the most significant piece of information when it comes to your security next to that pipeline. They won't release it, and they haven't released it to the counties, and you know, Ms. Burns-Thompson would just ask again, Navigator won't release that information. And so by the way, I don't know what was, I don't know whether it was a mischaracterization or not. I wasn't there. The reporter that reported that information was, you know, pretty reliable reporter, I think. Certainly, I don't think we're too dumb to understand safety modeling. I think we, as evidenced by a lot of people in this room, take these issues very seriously. I think a lot of people have become very educated on these topics. And so I think the people deserve to see that plume modeling. It's unfortunate that the counties set these ordinances and then don't have access to the plume modeling, and then Navigator says, well, we don't like your ordinances, so we're going to ask the PUC to override those ordinances. I don't think that's a good way to do business either. But I will say, just to conclude, that when it comes to the biggest, Elizabeth Burns-Thompson had mentioned bad actors. And with all due respect, the biggest threat to freedom and safety of these property owners is not bad actors. It's carbon sequestration pipeline companies that want to take their land without consent and put a dangerous pipeline in their ground.
This question goes first to Representative Hansen. Most Americans are for development and advancement until such efforts affect their own pocketbook or their property. Are opponents to the project offering any better alternatives that can help provide the same results that Summit and Navigator are seeking to achieve? Can you offer any alternatives to sustain the corn producers and ethanol producers of our state?
Well, sure, absolutely. In fact, I think there's been companies that have come into the state and talked to landowners about production of, I believe it's methanol is what it's called. You can capture the CO2 off of ethanol plants and make methanol. And by the way, that furthers I think, the industry's interest and purpose of making renewable fuels. And so there's plenty of alternatives. There's also on-site sequestration options and things of that nature. But the reality is, those aren't being funded by the 45Q tax credit. And so that's why those things aren't happening. But sure, there's all sorts of alternatives. A third alternative that I haven't mentioned is just let the plant food feed the plants. In fact, I think Ms. Burns-Thompson would acknowledge, based on her background, that if there's a little more CO2 in the air, it's actually good for the crops. It helps yields for our beans and our corn. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of alternatives. We do not have to cave to the markets of California and Washington and Oregon and Canada here in South Dakota. By the way, speaking of the Canadian market, you know what California, you know what California is doing with these pipelines? There's a moratorium in place. So in South Dakota here, we're bending to the market regulators in California, and they themselves won't even subject themselves to the risk of these pipelines. That's absurd. So there's plenty of alternatives. In my opinion, the best one is to let the carbon out and feed the plants.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, are the alternatives as attractive as Representative Hansen just described?
Sure. I think it's quite a bit more complex than what's been put forward. And one anecdote that you brought up at the end that I think is worth noting is you are right that there are prohibitions currently on CO2 pipelines in California. What I think is important to note, though, is of all of the states that you're looking at for the injection well permits, so those require we call them a Class 6, it's an underground injection well permit. The state with the most pending permits to do sequestration is actually the state of California. So there is proposed to be more sequestration happening in the state of California than anywhere else around this country. But looking at what else can be done, I think that it's important to note that you'll hear me talk about this as a not just a pipeline, but a transportation platform, right? We are the transporter of that CO2 on behalf of the entities that have partnered with us. If that molecule comes from an ethanol plant in South Dakota and they choose to send it ultimately to a sequestration well in central Illinois, that is their prerogative. It is our responsibility to build out that transportation infrastructure to connect that point A and point B and transport that product on their behalf. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about common carriers later on, so I'll save that piece for then. However, that pipeline can absolutely and will absolutely also have the ability to transport a molecule from that ethanol plant ultimately to potentially a different type of end use. Some of those end uses exist right now, be it bottling, right? I'm sure there's bubbly beverages here around this evening. Those that are involved in the hog sector, we actually use quite a bit of CO2 as part of euthanizing animals in this country, dry ice being another one of those large utilizers. That's today. One thing that I want to also highlight is we're not building infrastructure that's providing value just today. As Representative Hansen said, there are places that don't want to drive the same cars today, or tomorrow, I should say, than we drive today. That type of change is absolutely taking place. But just like how I said before, that it's a misnomer that we call them ethanol plants because they're providing so much more value than a gallon of fuel, so too is the opportunity that exists with that gallon of fuel into things like sustainable aviation fuel, new types of application. We put liquid fuels in a lot of things than just our cars and trucks. And the opportunity that exists in heavy machinery and things like airplanes are a great opportunity for this space, and our partners are looking at that. But these types of investments are necessary to be able to make that happen.
Next question is to Ms. Burns-Thompson. With any transport technology, there is risk. Unlike other firms, your Navigator team has been forthright about the risks, highlighting safety from step one. You stated this, quote, "Safety was part of our informational presentations when we introduced the project. We followed up with educational training sessions with local first responders across the project footprint. We will come back this fall and develop hyperlocal response plans. We're also equipping first responders with the tools, technologies, and equipment they need to effectuate those plans. Only at that point would we ever put the pipeline into service." Would you give our audience more details about the plans, training tools, and equipment your team will make available to South Dakota's first responders?
Sure, and I stand by everything I said there before because it's just as true today as it was then. In fact, I would have said exactly that same thing if given the opportunity to walk through. I think it's important, just like we talked about, I think Representative Hansen mentioned about distances, be it 3 miles or 300 feet or whatever that is. Safety is more complex than just a setback distance, and so too is preparation with first responders and communities and landowners along that route. And that's why we have a multifaceted engagement or multi-step process, and it's not just a one and done. So we were already out in the communities back in January and February of this year is when we conducted those initial CO2 trainings. Those were with first responders and mutual aid partners, right? We are in rural America. We depend on our neighbors. I grew up in a community with an entirely volunteer fire department. In fact, the Monroe Fire Department still is 100% volunteer. We recognize that that type of relationships are what makes rural America run, and that's why those meetings were broad. Following up on those trainings where we talk about the projects, we talk about the specifics of CO2, we talked about plume modeling during those meetings as well, because those are the entities and those are the individuals that are going to be tasked with responding, and they need an understanding about how this is actually somewhat similar to how they have done preparedness to the past. Many of you are probably very familiar with anhydrous. Where do we get our anhydrous from? Generally the co-op. The co-op has a large storage of a pressurized liquid, hazardous liquid. Very similar. Not exactly the same, but preparedness and plume models in response looks very similar in terms of preparation. I know I'm getting close on time. The next step of that is happening right now. In fact, we've started the first 2 to 3 weeks of those meetings over in Illinois, and we're beginning to move across the project footprint. For all of you, it would be this way. As we move from Illinois throughout up towards South Dakota, we are sitting down in every single county with the county EMA director, as well as, again, those mutual aid partners, regional hazmat, to talk through that ERP, Emergency Response Plan. That document is a template. Think of it like a generic form that you fill out and begin to populate with the things that are unique and valuable to you or your operation, similar to the forms that you may fill out at FSA or things like that, right? You make it your own, so too does that emergency response plan. That will not look the same from community to community and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We are developing those with the community partners right now. That grant program was also highlighted as part of that. Each of the community partners are getting access to that grant application. They can submit for materials. The last piece of that, and I know I'm very tight on time, is making sure that those documents are more than just words on a page or a binder that sits on a shelf and gets dusty. We are going to run drills and test those plans long before that asset is put into operation.
Representative Hansen, is Navigator's approach to the pipeline safety risk adequate?
Well, I don't think so. Not by a long shot. In fact, Ms. Burns-Thompson talking about those plume studies. Again, the most important piece of information when it comes to safety of these pipelines with the local fire department, but you won't release them. Navigator won't release them. So how are we supposed to deal with the safety concerns if we don't even see their own plume modeling? I've heard it said maybe it was by Navigator or Summit Carbon that they might do a grant program and maybe pay for some of these pieces of equipment. But many of you maybe have heard of the rupture that took place in Mississippi, and you might have read some of the news reports and things of that nature. And one of the things that they found is that emergency vehicles really struggle to get to these locations because there's so much dense carbon in the air. The internal combustion engine can't run in that atmosphere. And so now we're talking about, okay, well, do we need electric fire trucks? Do we need electric powered equipment for all of these places in order to make sure we can keep our people safe? I think that's a real concern. And if that's the case, that's a massive, massive burden on our local fire departments that are already extremely, extremely short funded. So I don't think it's right to do that to our local fire departments. And then finally, you look at the insurability of this project. If there's a pipeline that's proposed to run across your land, you might have asked your insurance company, is this insurable? And your insurance company probably told you, no, it is not. And so all of these things just evidence the fact that they haven't, in my opinion, done their due diligence on safety. They are not being forthcoming about the safety risks that they're subjecting the people of South Dakota to, our neighbors, some of you. And at the end of the day, if that doesn't happen, there's no way that this should be allowed to continue. In fact, part of the reason that there's a moratorium in California on the building of the pipelines like this is because the federal safety regulations haven't been adjusted yet. So all of these things that you've seen taking place in South Dakota, people coming onto people's houses, people going into people's shops, people drilling 90 feet underground, trampling all over crops, that's all done before these federal safety regulations are even in place. All before even a permit from the PUC, all without permission from the landowner. And so I think in South Dakota here, the cart has been put way, way ahead of the horse. I don't think the safety concerns have been adequately addressed, and unfortunately, I don't think they're going to be.
Along the same lines, Representative Hansen, nothing lasts forever. As pipelines age, they will likely need maintenance. They'll probably need repair on occasion. Someday they may even need to be removed and recycled. But Navigator has pledged to maintain and repair all CO2 pipelines in a regular, safe, and responsible manner. Isn't that assurance adequate?
It's not assurance for me if your house is right next to one of these pipelines and you're subjected to the risk of a plume coming over your house all the time. I mean, it's a lot of promises made, and I get that we're early in the process here. But I think landowners in South Dakota need to see some real actual assurance. Actions speak louder than words. And until landowners have that assurance, there's no way that a pipeline like this should be forced across somebody's land without their consent. It's one thing to voluntarily take on this risk, but it's a whole other issue if the risk is forced upon you. It's almost like it's all risk to the landowner and no reward whatsoever. So I'm not confident in any of the safety protocols that have been executed. In fact, I think they're still trying to hide the safety data. And so, no, I don't think that they've done a good enough job with safety. And I think the people of South Dakota deserve a lot better. They deserve a lot safer than what these companies are offering you.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, many South Dakotans have relied on the promise that Navigator has pledged as far as maintaining and repairing the pipelines. But what happens if years down the road, Navigator goes out of business? What if the pipeline operator goes bankrupt? In that case, on whom does the burden fall? Has money been set aside to cover that contingency? Will local landowners, farmers, and ranchers without engineering backgrounds be obligated to dig up and remove the pipelines?
It's a very good question. And frankly, we have pipelines in this country that have been in operation for decades, safely so. And I think it's important to highlight that the safety of the pipeline should be uniform in South Dakota. It should be just as safe here as it is in Nebraska, as it is in Illinois, as it is in Iowa, and as it is in the Minnesota part of our footprint, which is exactly why you have federal specifications and federal oversight as it relates to things like the design and construction and ultimately operations, all of that tied into safety. Those provisions also come into play as it would relate to potentially abandonment. Just from a tactical perspective, what does pipeline abandonment generally look like? More often than not, that is an abandonment in place. In large part, that is because you want to minimize soil disruption. However, an important caveat or characteristic as part of landowner negotiations, Representative Hansen said we should do this voluntarily. Voluntarily means negotiating terms that are important to landowners. Landowners may find it important to negotiate a term in that easement that says, in the event that this pipeline is no longer in service, what does that mean? Does that mean I would like to have it removed? That's a condition you can put into that easement agreement. That easement agreement is a binding contract between you as the landowner and us as the company, which means that's an enforceable agreement that you can hold us to in the event that that were to take place. Again, from a tactical perspective, generally the practice has been, like I said, abandonment in place, and the product is purged from those lines. Underneath places like roads or waterways, that pipeline is filled with some type of like a concrete slurry or some type of stable material as well. Those are capped and they stay in place. But again, I think that is an important piece to tee up, that absolutely voluntary is important. And negotiation is more than just dollars and cents. It's where that pipeline goes. It's how it's installed and potentially how it's potentially decommissioned down the road. And those are things and conversations that our folks are going out and having with landowners each and every day. The one thing that was also highlighted, I think, during the last remarks, that maybe not directly to this question, but actions speak louder than words. I couldn't agree with you more, which is also why I'm here tonight. But additionally, differentiating ourselves from some other operators, be it pipeline companies that have come before or others that may be out in the countryside. When we have had landowners that said, we don't want you on our land, we have done our absolute best to be respectful of that, be that through survey work or others. We believe actions speak louder than words, and we are holding ourselves and our teams to that exact same standard.
We're moving now to the topic of eminent domain. The first question goes to Ms. Burns-Thompson. In 2006, the Iowa legislature restricted eminent domain for economic development. Democrat Governor Tom Vilsack vetoed the bill, prompting the first special session of the legislature in 40 years. Governor Vilsack's veto was overridden 90-8 in the Iowa House and 41-8 in the Iowa Senate. Ms. Burns-Thompson, you're from Iowa. You grew up on a farm. You've stated this, quote, "Eminent domain does not save us time. It does not save us money. It does not make us any friends. We are incentivized to do this in a voluntary process as much as possible. When we talk about condemnation or eminent domain as a tool of last resort, we don't say that just to make ourselves feel good." Ms. Burns-Thompson, can this project be accomplished voluntarily without raising the specter of eminent domain, even as last resort?
So it's a very good question, and I want to say that one of the other approaches that we take, and myself personally, is that we don't shy away from conversations about the topic. So if a landowner or anyone wants to talk about condemnation or eminent domain, that is a conversation I'm more than willing to have. What I think is also very important, and we'll get to the root of your question here, but the application or the process associated with condemnation is a function of the state. And thus, it is different in South Dakota than it is in Iowa, than it is in Illinois, than it is in Nebraska, functionally as well as how it's applied. What doesn't change is our philosophy and how we go about that. So everything that you just heard there, exactly what I would have said this evening as well, but if for even sheer business practice, we are incentivized to do this development in a voluntary fashion, and as much of a voluntary fashion as is possible. Can I guarantee to you tonight that we can do every single mile of this without some application necessarily so? And I say necessary for a reason. No, I can't make that commitment tonight. And I don't think that there has been a pipeline developed or a piece of linear infrastructure that has been developed today that can make that pledge either. What I can assure you is that we are utilizing that as an absolute tool of last resort. And to date, we have had no application of eminent domain. We haven't filed no cases in relation to that. So any claims that somehow Navigator is taking land or has any claims to take land is just false. What I will say is also important is that we are having those conversations early, though. We want to make sure that folks are comfortable that we're having dialogue so that we don't have to get to a condemnation proceeding. We want this to be collaborative. We want this to be voluntary.
Representative Hansen, your reply.
Well, thanks for that question. You know, Ms. Burns-Thompson a couple answers ago said that she wants these negotiations to be voluntary and that they're using eminent domain as a last resort. And with all due respect, neither of those things are fully accurate. If you look at Navigator's opening letter to landowners that they send to landowners, on the first page of that letter, they're already threatening to use eminent domain. And so if we want to talk about a voluntary transaction, well, let me tell you a story. I'll tell you a story of Wendy Schultz. Wendy Schultz is a resident of the Watertown area. And she had a piece of ground that her family lived on for a long time, and she had a dream. She wanted her son to move back to that piece of ground and for the family to live together. You know, her and her husband on one side of the section and her son and his family on the other side of the section. Those plans were in the works. Summit Carbon Solutions comes up to the Schultz property and they say, hey, we're going to lay this pipeline. And she said, well, I don't want to lay that pipeline. I don't want it here. My son's going to move back and we want to build his house there. At the end of that negotiation, so to speak, Summit Carbon Solutions said to Wendy Schultz, we're going to put that pipeline here whether you like it or not. And really, that's an encapsulation expressly of what happens implicitly in all of these agreements. Because the landowner is going to get that letter and they're going to say, well, we got this letter. It looks like they want to lay this pipeline. I see that they're threatening eminent domain. Let's see what their opening offer is. And maybe it's a lower opening offer. So they say no. So the pipeline company comes back and says, well, let's do a little higher offer. So they sweeten the pot and do a little higher offer. And the landowner still says no. Well, okay. So the landowner has said no, thank you. But at the end of the day, they know, because they've already been threatened, that if they say no to this deal, they're going to have to hire a lawyer and go to court, and the pipeline company is going to try to take their land through eminent domain, whether they like it or not. And no matter how you slice it, that's not a voluntary negotiation. That's coercion. That's coercion. So I think eminent domain really gets to the heart of this issue. You know, Ms. Burns-Thompson said, you know, a lot of other infrastructure projects have used eminent domain in the past. Just out of curiosity, I mean, we're talking about public use when we're talking about eminent domain. How many here use water, right? How many use the roads, right? How many capture, compress, and sequester carbon? No hands. So when we talk about eminent domain, we talk about what's in the public use. The bottom line here is that this is not in the public use and it should not be eligible for eminent domain.
Next question, we start with Representative Hansen. Back in June, you posted photos showing Summit Carbon Solutions entering onto landowners' property, drilling into the ground, even trampling crops without a PUC permit. You stated this: these photos taken today show Summit Carbon Solutions, accompanied by law enforcement, surveying land without the farmer's permission. Look at how they trample crops with complete disregard. This is not freedom. Was Summit's conduct without legal authority or outside its legal authority?
Well, that's a great question. And the technical answer to that is no, because the legislature in 2016 passed this absolutely absurd statute that allows for pipeline companies to go and survey land before there's even a PUC permit, before they're approved for a permit. So they were following that statute. That was litigated. A judge looked at it, read the statute. I didn't talk to the judge, and so I don't know all the ins and outs, but the judge looked at the statute and said, nope, they have the authority. I don't think what the judge really looked at was the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, because I think an honest and accurate application of the Constitution will say, this is not in the public use, just what we talked about. You cannot use eminent domain for this project. And so if you're complying with the statutes, that's one thing, and that's good, of course, but you also have to comply with the Constitution. You know, we talked about the Fifth Amendment. The South Dakota Constitution also, in the first article of our Bill of Rights, guarantees you the inherent right to acquire and protect private property, and that governments are instituted amongst men to protect those rights. And so, were they operating under color of the statute? I think the answer is unfortunately and technically yes, and that statute absolutely needs to be amended. Were they acting according to these people's private property rights and their constitutional liberty interests? Absolutely not. There's no doubt about it. And by the way, that's not even really an eminent domain issue. They weren't even taking the property at the time. They were just going onto people's land without consent. That's called a taking under constitutional jurisprudence. And there's court cases directly on point. And I think you're going to see this because this is getting litigated in the South Dakota Supreme Court. I think what you're going to see is that was a clear violation of those landowners' constitutional rights. Imagine if that was your home. Imagine if you were Jared Bosley, and all of a sudden people show up at your house, and they're entering into your front door while your wife is getting out of the shower. They're entering into your shop. They're trampling all over your crops with complete disregard. They're drilling 90 feet into the ground for a 4-foot pipeline, and they won't tell Jared why they're even drilling that deep. He has no idea. I don't think they ever told him. Imagine if that was your land, how invasive that is. That's a complete violation of his property rights. It's a complete violation, period. And so, whether they're operating in accord with the statute is one thing. Clearly, they're violating these people's constitutional rights, and that kind of conduct needs to stop in the state of South Dakota.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, understanding you work for Navigator and not Summit, what is your response to Summit's conduct described in my question? Is Navigator or will Navigator enter onto private property as described? And if so, to do what and under what authority?
It's a good question, and I think Representative Hansen teed it up very appropriately that there is the letter of the law, and then there's also another layer of being good operators and being good partners with landowners. And that's what we are striving to do. You've heard me say that time and time again tonight. One of the things that I referenced in an earlier question was the fact that we have, when asked to stay off of a parcel, we have done our best to not be on that parcel. We have tried to be accommodating when folks have had special requests as part of that survey work. So yes, we are trying to follow not just the letter of the law, but to the best of our abilities, also the spirit of the law, and frankly, what is the right way to go about doing business in a collaborative sense. To the nature of the survey work, I think Representative Hansen brought up an interesting point about they were surveying before they had a permit. It's an interesting kind of chicken or the egg type of conversation because you necessarily need results and information from surveys. We need a lot of other information, and I'll get to that too, that's found outside of surveys, but that technical survey information, be it topographical, right? So think physical lay of the land, some environmental survey work. Again, those are critically important to a lot of the federal permits as well as state permits that we need. Geotechnical surveys, which are incredibly important. That is specifically a lesson learned out of the incident in Mississippi, in Satarsha. They did not do the geotechnical survey work there that would have indicated or likely shown the incidence of a mudslide. We have taken that to heart. We are doing 100% geotechnical surveys on our pipeline footprint, again, showcasing lessons learned from operators before. But that type of survey work, that information from those surveys, is what helps us craft and put forward a proposal for the permits, for consideration by those subject matter experts, be it the South Dakota PUC, the Army Corps of Engineers, and other agencies that are doing their due diligence to evaluate the credentials of the project. We necessarily need that information. Now, you note I said we need not only technical information, we need other information as well. You told a story about future kind of development on a particular parcel, someone that was be able to bring the next generation home. I think that's fantastic. I come from a first generation family farm. I would love nothing more than for my sister and her boyfriend, hopefully soon fiance, that's on the record, Logan, to be able to come back to our farm. That being said, there is no database of future dream homes. There's no database we can download to be able to incorporate that into our permitting and our routing. We will absolutely do our darndest to be able to incorporate that into our footprint, but we don't know information like that unless and until we can have a conversation with the landowner and or potentially the tenant, because a lot of ag land, we have that separated between those two things.
Let's move now to the topic of effect on atmospheric CO2 levels. The first question goes to Ms. Burns-Thompson. Many in our nation are concerned with climate change and the effect of CO2 levels in our atmosphere. In an effort to reduce the CO2 footprint of the ethanol industry, are the methods proposed effective to any significant degree?
Sure. So what I'll start with is regardless of your personal opinions, for, against, neutral, strongly, less on climate change, you can still be a supporter and see economic and value in development of carbon management infrastructure like what we are developing at Navigator. The other thing that I think is important to keep into context is no one industry solves a global problem. Everyone can do what's within their control, and that's what we're focused on here. So to break it down of what does the impact of something like this or the adoption of carbon capture technology do? I think it's important, and those of you that have followed the ethanol industry know that they have made pledges to reach net zero, net neutral by a date certain. Adoption of carbon capture technology gets them about halfway there. So to put some numbers specifically to that, corn ethanol scores, and again, we're getting into some numbers here, a CI or a carbon intensity score, on average, between 60 or 70. Now, that's on average. Every plant has its own individual score. Once a plant adopts carbon capture technology, so capturing the CO2 off their fermenters and not emitting it like they generally are doing right now, you reduce that score by 30 points. So again, relatively in half. You'll note I didn't say we get them all the way there. That this is going to be likely partnered with additional investments, optimizations that these plants are making both on site as well as increased valuation into the feedstock coming into each of those facilities, because part of that ultimate score is also the score associated with each bushel of grain coming into that facility as well. So we see, and I think our shippers see, an opportunity not only to help meet those carbon-based goals and pledges that they have made, but also have that value opportunity exist, not just for the plant, but that entire supply chain, all the way back down to the farm gate.
Representative Hansen, your response.
Well, I think it is effective if your goal is to capture 45Q tax credits. Then I think it's effective. If your aim is to somehow change the global temperature, no, it's nothing. I mean, you have to remember, and Ms. Burns-Thompson sort of alluded to this, India, China, other industries in America, all huge contributors to carbon entering the atmosphere, even if you believe that that's a real problem that we need to be addressing. These sequestration efforts won't do a thing for the overall global temperature. I mean, I often remember that the land that we're standing on right now used to be so cold that there was literally a glacier standing above us. That's how the East River Plains were formed. It's a giant glacier. And then, at one point, it was so warm that there were literally some of the world's largest T-Rexes roaming the state of South Dakota, roaming the land, all without 1 ounce of human interaction with carbon. So, no. I mean, the answer is, and I think we all know it, putting the sort of political and corporate talking points aside, we are not going to affect the carbon in the atmosphere one bit. If your goal is to lower the overall carbon in the atmosphere, this ain't gonna do anything for you. If your goal is to collect a boondoggle of federal tax money, inflationary debt spending from the federal government, then I guess this is the project for you.
Next question is for Representative Hansen. I'm going to quote Ms. Burns-Thompson. She said something similar tonight, but I'm going to quote her as reported previously in the paper. When asked why a skeptic of man-made climate change would support this project, Ms. Burns-Thompson replied this: "You do not have to be a believer in climate change to see and quantify the value of carbon capture technology and infrastructure projects like ours. The ability to really create an efficient, reliable transportation system for CO2 is an economic opportunity for the Midwest. The ability to match a willing paying customer to a willing supply from the marketplace is capitalism." Representative Hansen, isn't she right?
No, no. With all due respect, she's not right. Remember, as we've discussed, you haven't forgot, this is being funded by billions of dollars in inflationary debt spending. There's no market for that. That's doing a huge disservice. I mean, I know that you're all feeling the effects of inflation. That happens in large part in America today because of the outrageous debt spending that the United States of America is engaging in. That's not good for us, and it's irresponsible of us to put that debt upon our kids and our grandkids. So no, there's no economic opportunity there, even if you don't support, the sort of leftist climate agenda. In fact, it's doing more harm than good, because if you're going to keep spending money into oblivion, you're going to keep spending this country into oblivion, you're going to see inflation go through the roof. You're already paying for it, by the way, just in inflationary costs. You see it at the grocery store every time you go to the grocery store. This is only going to compound that. It's only going to make matters worse. And by the way, if you wanted to do it voluntarily, I mean, there's a lot of federal programs, frankly, that I think are completely asinine. So much wasteful federal spending. But I don't spend my time, session after session in Pierre, going after those things. There's only so many things you can do, and the feds do, very idiotic, dumb spending over and over again, and there's only so many things that you can accomplish. You can't really shut that down. So, you know what, I don't like it, but there's only so much you can do. But the point underlying it all is that if you're going to do it, at least do it voluntarily. If you're going to subject somebody to a pipeline across their land that's uninsurable, that exposes them to a lot of risk, that drives down the value of their property, by the way. If you want to build another house on your property, if you have a building eligibility, but that building eligibility goes away because of this pipeline, that's a decline in your value. It's not an increase, it's a decline. So at the end of the day, what this all comes down to is your ability to choose what you do with your own property. And if you want to take on that risk, if you want to take on that decline because they pay you a check, be my guest. I think it's wasteful federal spending, but I can't get in the way. But it comes down to being voluntary. That's what it's really all about. Don't take these people's land without their consent.
Ms. Burns-Thompson, your response.
Sure. As I've kind of stated there before, I believe that to be true, that while we don't always maybe agree with what consumers want, we might not always pay for that. A carbon characteristic may not be what you look for when you drive up to the gas pump. However, that doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't do it. And what we're seeing is that not only does somebody else do it, but our largest customer base to date is saying that that's important. I'm not here to tell you whether that is right or wrong. I'm also not here to tell you whether federal tax policy is right or wrong. I'm telling you these are the cards that this economy and agriculture in the Corn Belt has been dealt. And we can choose to be prosperous, or we can have things done onto us. And what the industry has taken the opportunity to do is to say, we want to thrive based on the marketplaces that we have, and largely the marketplaces that we've developed and the cards that we've been dealt. And thus you've seen the development in this space.
Last question. First to Ms. Burns-Thompson. Is there common ground between both positions? And if so, where is it?
I would agree that there absolutely is. I think we found at least a half a dozen things this evening that we agree upon. Maybe not into the intricate details, but I think overall, we want the Midwest to be successful. We want agriculture to be prosperous. That's going to continue to take investments. It means that we're going to continue to farm differently than what our fathers farmed like and our grandfathers farmed like. And these facilities, these processors, will also continue to look different over the years. Change is necessary. Investment is necessary. That's what keeps rural America alive. And I think that's something, be it vitality here in the rural and the metropolitan parts of South Dakota or all across the Corn Belt, is something that I assume we can agree upon, and that the investments, and there is a right way to go about development of infrastructure, like you've said, in a voluntary fashion, in a collaborative fashion, in a transparent fashion. I say those terms specifically. Those happen to also be the core values of Navigator.
Representative Hansen, is there common ground between the two positions?
Well, I do agree that most people in this room, and I think Navigator and Summit Carbon Solution, I mean, I think we're all invested in one way or the other in the vitality of the ethanol industry in this region. I think it's very, very important to farmers all across South Dakota. And so, yeah, I think that's very important. I also agree with the vitality of our small towns. I mean, I think our small towns are what, I mean, no offense to our friends from Sioux Falls, but I think our small towns are really what make up the heart of the state of South Dakota. When it comes to other areas of overlap, sort of like what I indicated in my last response, I think if you did this voluntary, and I think if you did it safely, I don't think you'd see very many people in this room tonight. But when you start coming into South Dakota and try to take people's land without their consent and subject them, whether they like it or not, to safety risks, that's where the problem is. Do it voluntarily. Commit to doing it voluntarily. We didn't get that commitment tonight. We got the opposite tonight. We got a sort of pledge that probably they're going to use eminent domain. And let's be honest, they're going to have to use eminent domain, and they're going to try to use eminent domain. And you've seen it with Summit Carbon Solutions, by the way. And I do appreciate, by the way, you know, to Navigator's credit, I think they've been a little more landowner friendly than Summit Carbon Solutions. Summit Carbon Solutions right now is suing, 120 landowners about in the state of South Dakota to take and use their land without their consent. And that's just absolutely wrong. So do it voluntarily. They still have the option to do that. They still have the opportunity to do that. They haven't sued anybody yet like Summit Carbon Solutions has. And by the way, I'm not just beating up on Summit Carbon Solutions, even though they're not here. Number one, I think they can take it. And number two, they were invited, and they refused to come have this conversation publicly. Yeah. So, again, I do really appreciate Ms. Burns-Thompson for being willing to come and have this conversation publicly. I think that's really good. So at the end of the day, if you do it voluntarily and if you do it safely, I think I'm mostly satisfied.
It's now time for our closing statements. The coin toss winner, Elizabeth Burns-Thompson, gets to go first. You have 5 minutes.
Sure. And I will commit to you that one of the other sentiments that I live by is I believe brevity is an art form, so I'm going to do my best not to use that full 5 minutes. I hope that I've left you this evening with more answers than questions. However, as I said in my opening, I hope that this is just the start of a constructive dialogue. We truly want to be collaborative. I want to have the opportunity to communicate, which is more than just dispersion of information. I want to have a conversation. I don't have my phone up here, but I answer my phone all the time. I sit down with landowners just about any time that we can. In fact, I spent 3 hours with a landowner in a coffee shop just outside of Sioux Falls. I personally take the time because I'm investing not only myself and my time and my reputation in this project. I want, at the end of the day, this to be something that I personally can be proud of, all of you in this room to be proud of, the shippers that have partnered with us on this project to be proud of, the communities that we cross to be proud of, and this to be something that truly is transformative, not just for ethanol, but for production agriculture, and that we are truly leaving it in a better place than the way that we found it. And so thank you all for taking the time to sit here this evening, and I hope that you found it beneficial, and please, this is an open invitation. Please reach out and continue the dialogue.
Representative Hansen, you have 5 minutes for your closing.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks again to the organizers and everybody who worked so hard to put this together, Carrie, Catherine. Really, really appreciate it. I think it's great. Today, what's happening in South Dakota, we have out-of-state foreign-backed pipeline companies coming into our state and trying to take land and use it without their consent. It is absolutely wrong. We didn't talk about the ownership of those companies, but I think it's important to just pause and reflect on that for a second. In the case of Navigator CO2, 84% of Navigator CO2 is owned by BlackRock. It sounds like many of you are familiar with BlackRock. It's a multinational investment company based out of New York City. Our own congressman recently put out a statement very concerned about the national security risks that BlackRock is engaged in by investing in blacklisted Chinese companies. A lot of states won't even, well, not a lot, but there's a number of states that won't even do business with BlackRock because of some of their policies. And their CEO recently, you maybe saw this video, maybe you didn't, was in an interview where he said, you know what, you have to use these corporations to go and force behavior on people. That's BlackRock. Another 14% of Navigator CO2 is owned by a fund out of the United Arab Emirates. And then there's less than 2% that's actually owned by people, whether they're from here in South Dakota or somewhere else, I have no idea. But let's just think about that for a second. Here in the state of South Dakota, in what is supposed to be the land of the free, we are going to allow for BlackRock and a fund out of the United Arab Emirates to come and take people's land without their consent, our fellow South Dakotans? That is absolutely wrong. In South Dakota, we still believe that private property rights means more than you get to own and enjoy the property until some out-of-state foreign-backed company decides they want to come use it so they can line their pockets with federal tax credits. That's not us. That's not South Dakota. In South Dakota, we still hold to our state motto, under God, the people rule. Not under God, the corporations rule. Not under God, BlackRock rules. Under God, the people rule. And that's you, and that's the landowners that are affected by these pipelines. They ought to be able to control whether this pipeline comes across their land or not. So, to the landowners, to the farmers, to the families who are affected by this, I just encourage you to keep up the fight, keep up the faith. You are absolutely in the right on this issue. Although Navigator's been a little friendly, we got to be honest about that. Do not ever allow yourself to be bullied or intimidated by the likes of Summit Carbon Solutions. And look around you. Look at the people here that are here in support of you, the landowners. We got your back. There's people in your government that got your back. And at the end of this, the landowners are going to prevail. I truly believe that. God bless you. Appreciate you coming out.
Thank you so much to our speakers. If you liked this event, you're going to like what the rest of the state of South Dakota puts on with regard to its local Republican women clubs. Did you know that we have 13 clubs across the state of South Dakota, one of which is a virtual club called Cyberspace? No matter where you are, no matter how close you are to a local club, you can just log in and take part in those presentations via Zoom. We host candidates, speakers, and presenters on issues of the day. So as you walk out, hit the table, grab a brochure, and get plugged in with a local club and the South Dakota Federated Republican Women. An extra special thank you to this lady, Catherine Barranco, for her help today. Thank you to the Sioux River Republican Women, the Dakota Scout, SDFRW, and to our fantastic speakers. Thank you so much for your time. Drive home safely, everyone. South Dakota members, SDFRW members, come on up for a photo at this time. Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thanks. Oh, good. Good.